Okay, well, hi everyone. Welcome to today's webinar, which is part of the Early Years in Mind network at Anna Freud, where we provide guidance on supporting the mental health of babies, young children and their families. My name's Claudia Cousins and I'm the Deputy Head of the Early Years and Prevention Department and an adult counsellor by training. We especially appreciate you joining us today while it's so sunny outside. I'll start with some housekeeping. Closed captions will be available during the webinar. Please click on the closed captions button to enable these at the bottom of your screen. The chat function is disabled during the webinar, so if you have any questions, please submit them via the Q&A function. There's also the option to upvote any popular questions. The webinar will be recorded and available on Anna Freud's YouTube channel. The BSL interpreters are with us for the duration of the webinar. To make sure they are visible on your screen, please use the option Follow the Host View, which you can find on the top right-hand side of your screen. If you have any technical issues, please put them in the Q&A function. A member of the Anna Freud Centre will be able to assist. In the chat now is a link for the Early Years in Mind members to fill out a quick survey, and this is so our webinar schedule and resources for the next academic year are informed by you. For today's webinar, as well as focusing on the relationship between infants, caregivers and practitioners, we know that mental health doesn't occur in a vacuum. So the resources and webinars we run as part of this network also take into account the wider social and policy context. Today, we have a brilliant panel who will be talking about attachment theory and its application in the criminal justice system. As well as the specific information relating to the criminal justice system, there will be takeaways and learning for practitioners in the wider early years as well. We'll be hearing from Professor Peter Fonagy, our CEO at Anna Freud, and Professor of Psychoanalysis and Developmental Science and Head of the Division of Psychology and Language Sciences at University College London. We'll also be hearing from Kirsty Kitchen, Head of Policy and Communications at Birth Companions, and Dr. Christy Pitfield, Principal Clinical Psychologist and Clinical Lead at the Prison Perinatal Mental Health Service in Central and North West London NHS Foundation Trust, and her colleague at the same Foundation Trust, Dr. Caroline Pontver, Consultant Perinatal Psychiatrist. In a moment, we'll hear presentations from our panelists and then have time for Q&A, but I'll start by setting the scene. First, a note on language. We're referring mainly to women, mothers, and caregivers for accuracy in order to reflect the majority of the research we refer to and the names of the support services, such as mother and baby units. But we recognise that maternity care is also accessed and should be accessible to all birthing people, including trans men and non-binary people. Women and babies in prisons have received heightened press coverage recently. Although in some ways this is positive because awareness is being raised relating to the care received and the wider ethics of incarcerating pregnant women and babies, it's also highlighted some tragedies. In the last 4 years, 2 babies have died in British prisons, Aisha Cleary and baby Brooke. These tragic deaths have raised the questions about whether pregnant women should be imprisoned at all. In the Early Years and Prevention Department, we share the position with Birth Companions that they shouldn't, and we'll be hearing more from Kirsty later about why. Kirsty will not only be reflecting on women in mother and baby units, but also in the community where there is still involvement with the criminal justice system. Although there is a lot of work to be done, as a recent Birth Companions report is entitled, it's also a window of opportunity to make changes. We know that an end to pregnant women being in prison is a long-term goal, which is why we have to support those women who are already there and ensure they receive the highest quality care possible. They are entitled to the care they need and will most support them and their babies to have the best start in life. Christy and Caroline will expand on this and will also be talking about the idea of equity of care. As they state in their recent rapid review of clinical risk factors for poor perinatal mental health in prisons, pregnancy and the first year after childbirth are a high-risk period of a woman's life, and research shows that women in prisons are at heightened risk for poor mental health, self-harm and suicide. Thinking about equity rather than equality is important when we consider the inequalities that exist not just across the criminal justice system, but across our maternity and mental health sectors as well, because all of the services are interconnected. Although they are made up of a talented workforce, they also reflect societal discrimination. For example, evidence from Embrace UK and Birthrights tell us that Black and Asian women have the poorest maternal clinical outcomes in England, and this demonstrates the institutional and systemic racism that's present. And returning to the criminal justice system, we also know that ethnically minoritized groups have a different experience. For example, they are more likely to be held in remand for longer periods than their white counterparts, yet also more likely to be acquitted. Many of you here today will know about the impact of some of these statistics. And what we're hoping to do today is apply theory and expertise from our respective practice areas to explore what can be done in this complex area. I'm delighted to introduce our first speaker, Professor Peter Fonagy, who will talk to us about attachment theory and mentalization in practice, and reflect on how these theories can be applied in different settings and across different cultures. Over to you, Peter.
And thank you very much, Claudia. That's wonderful, and I hope that you can see me. I can't see myself, but there I am. So it's wonderful to be here, and it's such an important area for us to consider together. If you go to the next slide, please. So I'm going to cover 7 points briefly. Just generally a brief reminder about attachment theory, and then turn in on myself, against myself, and try and say why attachment theory doesn't really have it all. And try and turn towards culturally sensitive attachment theory and attachment practice, which I hope we will be able to adopt. I would like to talk about my own interest in attachment theory and mentalizing, but also to test mentalizing theory against cultures. And finally, just a brief point about how attachment, mentalizing, and policy actually interface with the criminal justice system. If I can have the next slide, please. So just very briefly about, thank you, about attachment theory. We know that babies form bonds or attachments, and that's necessary for them to survive. Children under 5 generate these bonds because they cry and exercise other attachment behaviors that trigger something in all of us to care for them. But then these bonds are lasting. And the evolutionary source or origin of this is probably one of protection. I will later suggest that maybe it goes beyond that in humans. But biologically, this is a strong bond. However, it is a bond that is conditioned by the social context that it's in. So to say that we know what attachment is actually being disrespectful of the system that's far more sensitive to cultural context than previously recognized. In Western cultures, and probably this applies in other cultures as well, usually we talk about secure attachment that's associated with optimally regulated emotion. We also talk about avoidant attachment that's particularly characterized by the child decreasing or manipulating downwards their attachment needs, and insecure ambivalent attachment, which is the opposite, upregulating attachment needs. And finally, there is disorganized or dysregulated attachment where emotion regulation is really a focus of issues. Attachment, as we know, is intergenerational. So when we think about a woman who is pregnant in the criminal justice system, the kind of bonds that she will be predisposed to form with her child will depend strongly on her experience. But let me go on to the next slide, because all this is, I think, a very weird view. Weird in the sense of Western, educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic. It is a Western middle-class privileged view of the world that is actually only characteristic properly of about 5% of the population in this country. Culturally sensitive attachment has to take on board very different forms of childcare. And if I can just have the next slide, I'm just going to characterize two forms, which is a caricature, if you like, of Western style and a caricature of a much more communal style of attachment. But I say caricature because even within our cultural context, these don't exist in pure forms. But in Western or weird attachments, there's a face-to-face interaction between the caregiver and the child, and the infant's point of view is paramount. The verbal interchange takes place on a serve and return basis. One party in this exchange, usually the infant, says something or expresses something, and the caregiver mirrors it or reflects on it. And then we talk about the sensitive on the part of the caregiver. But the infant learns primarily about themselves through these interactions, and only secondarily learns about others. But in other cultures, the infant is turned outwards. The infant faces the world and is supported to take the perspective of others, to understand what others experience, think, or feel. And the caregiver guides the infant like an apprentice, and the infant only secondarily learns about themselves. So what you should get from this is that good caregiving is not exclusively defined by dyadic sensitivity. It is also with reference to the cultural context that the child is in. And much of attachment actually depends on the cultural context. If I can have the next slide, please. So in these two extreme cases, in the dyadic turn-taking interaction, that supports a cultural ideal of infant as an agent, and their personal qualities and attributes are the primary reference. The infant recognizes the mother's representation of them as the central agent and learns about the self, feeling themselves to be, in a sense, the center of the universe. And anything short of that then feels, in a way, a loss of identity. But in a different context, where children and caregivers engage in multiple simultaneous activities, where the infant is passed on from one adult to another, and sometimes in 20 times within an hour period, the infant becomes sensitized to others as what their interests are, and no longer sees themselves as primary reference, but sees others. And what parents socialize their children to be is to derive meaning and their identity from their community rather than themselves. So what am I saying here? That we need a kind of Copernican revolution that seeing the family as a closed system is not really what evolutionary attachment theory is about. Attachments are embedded in the community that the family finds themselves in. Attachments are broader than the nuclear family. So, if I can have the next slide, please. Attachment then is not just relevant to parents. It's relevant to all those who actually support the child. Early years workers, NHS workers, in this case, prison staff. Focusing on your own well-being as practitioners and recognizing your own past history of attachments influence the way that you interact with a young human is, of course, important. But also, I think we have to be aware that anyone who has the responsibility of giving care to a young person, to a young infant, needs our support. So attachment relationships actually take place in the context of a community where we each support each other to look after the child. It does literally take a village to raise a child. So cultural differences really matter. The living conditions of the family really matter because they condition the extent to which this contextual support can be provided. Past experiences of everyone in the system matters. And of course, the mental health of the caregivers matters very much too. But let me just now move to mentalizing, as it is so significantly and crucially related to attachment. So mentalizing is a core human function of being able to understand other people's behavior in terms of mental states, in terms of thoughts, feelings, wishes, beliefs, desires. It is about being curious about what may be behind someone's actions. And that curiosity actually enables us to predict and also make comprehensible to ourselves what they think or feel. Babies tuning into their feelings actually means understanding what's behind their emotional reactions and creating for them a real sense that they have thoughts and feelings. They have thoughts and feelings that we actually respond to. And our reactions to them are in terms of our anticipation of their experience. So recognizing their fear is critical. In toddlers, also allowing their sense of independence, their wishes for themselves, to be able to soothe them, but also to be able to reflect to them our sense of their emotional experience enables them to feel that those feelings that they are aware of are valid and are part of a human communication that is primarily in terms of mental state. All that takes place in the context of failure. We understand others not through being sensitive, but actually through moments when we lose that sensitivity. It is a repair and rupture that actually is really important in the creation of awareness of each other as thinking, feeling, believing human beings. We need to, first of all, lose that connection in order for the other person to be aware of how much we seek them out, So actually what we know about attachment and what we know about mentalizing is that as much as sensitivity matters, so does the capacity to repair the loss of connection between two human beings. So seeking the ideal of mutual understanding is perhaps less important than actually being there when our sensitivity is needed, when the child, the infant, is experiencing distress, and for us to be able to repair that distress. But let me move on quickly to how mentalizing varies in cultures, because mentalizing is a developmental achievement. It is through being recognized as a thinker that we become aware of our thoughts. So there are cultural differences where mentalizing matters more or less, or what thoughts or feelings are focused on, and what thoughts or feelings are less likely to be recognized and more likely to be ignored. Context matters in the way our thinking about what others think or feel can develop. Failures of mentalizing, not understanding either our own children or creating environment where feelings are not recognized, when a child is neglected, creates a vulnerability, and actually creates a vulnerability because mentalizing is so important for regulating feelings and experiences of oneself, as well as understanding others. So if one was ignored and one's feelings were not recognized, one is not going to be as able to recognize feelings and beliefs and thoughts and feelings in others. So mentalizing is a relevant factor in psychopathology, but probably not equally relevant in all cultural contexts. Some cultural contexts, it may be less important to be attuned to others' thoughts and feelings. But in all cultural contexts, being able to engage in collaboration makes mentalizing important. But mentalizing is not a single capacity. It has all kinds of components, particularly concerned with others or with the self. Some people are able to mentalize others very well, but actually are at a loss of thinking about themselves. Some people are better able to understand thoughts, but actually are at a loss in understanding feelings. Others may be the other way around. Some people are really good at being attuned to others, but when asked to think about others and reflect on their feelings, they can't find the words. Some people are really good at giving you long explanations, but actually in implicit mentalizing, in quick responses, do poorly. And some people are really good at responding to external cues, facial expressions, for example, about other people's current feelings. But actually, when looking inwards, when looking inside, they see nothing very clearly. Others actually miss even important external cues very quickly. And finally, in the next slide, I just want to draw your attention to how all this really interfaces with the way we look at the criminal justice system. We are looking at working with people who have had periods often of neglect, of abuse, where actually thinking about needing people, feeling trust towards others, is really, one cannot blame them for not wanting to engage in that level of interaction with fellow humans because they had been so often disappointed in the past. But when we think about mothers in this part of the criminal justice system, these are very often mothers who have been so traumatized themselves that they have difficulties or may have difficulties in engaging with the helplessness that they see in their child. But also the cultural diversity we see in the prison system should make us aware that they might have very different views about what's important in attachment, because the context that they were brought in may be very different. And finally, that in what I hope I got through in my brief introduction, that so much depends on the context, so much depends on how people are supported, so much depends for mothers in the prison system, whether there or when they are discharged from the system, how they are supported in their context and what they have to do to achieve support, because attachment and mentalizing is the business of a village, is the business of a community, and not simply the business of a single nuclear family. And thank you very, very much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Peter, for this first discussion in today's webinar. You've really helped to kind of identify how we can apply attachment theory and mentalizing in the context of many social complexities and across different cultures. So we'll move swiftly on now to Kirsty Kitchen from Birth Companions, and we'll have time for questions at the end of the webinar.
Thank you, Claudia, and thank you, Peter. I feel like I would like to have Peter's final thoughts there recorded and available for me to play at the start of pretty much every conversation I have in this space moving forwards. I just wanted to take a moment to acknowledge how powerful it is to have the Anna Freud Centre bringing their spotlight to the issues relating to pregnancy and early motherhood in the criminal justice system. And I think Peter just summed it up incredibly well. I'm going to talk very briefly today about the importance of centering a focus on those women, and as Claudia explained in her introduction, I will be looking at prisons and the community criminal justice contexts, which have a lot less attention brought to bear on them, and also the sort of multi-agency dependencies. This is a very complex area, so I will try and do it justice. There is, if people are interested in exploring these issues further, a huge amount of resources on our website at Birth Companions, filterable according to criminal justice system, the family justice system and children's social care, the immigration system, etc. And I know that some links are being shared while I talk. So next slide, please. Just a little bit about Birth Companions, because there are a lot of people joining today and many of you won't have heard of us. We are a charity that was founded in 1996. We were born out of the furore that kicked off after a Channel 4 Dispatches documentary showed some secret filming of a woman who was in custody at Holloway Prison in London at the time, who was at the local hospital in the early stages of labour, and she was shackled. And it created a huge amount of outrage among the public, really, and in Parliament, that such a practice was happening in the mid-90s in England. Although interestingly at the time, the Justice Secretary said that it was an entirely defensible practice. Thankfully, that was addressed, and women can no longer be handcuffed during active labour. Although concerns still exist, but we were created out of all of that noise to bring emphasis to the needs of pregnant women and mothers of infants in the prison system. Since then, we have very quickly evolved to have a focus on prisons and women in the community who may or may not have some form of criminal justice contact, but are experiencing very acute inequality and disadvantage in many different forms. We provide lots of frontline services, advocacy support, and my role at Birth Companions is to work with our services and our amazing team of lived experience, women with lived experience, to shape policy and practice, and we do that across the criminal justice system, children's social care, immigration and maternity. I should explain that we have a big focus on the social determinants of health. So we're not clinicians, but we bring to bear an understanding of where health vulnerabilities and health inequalities come from. And we adopt a reproductive justice framework, which you can read more about on our website. It's a fast-moving space. Next slide, please. So just a little bit of information about women in prison in England. I'm saying in England, there's currently no women's prison in Wales. And in Scotland, there is a markedly different system in some respects. So we have a focus on prisons in England. There are 12 women's prisons. 6 of them have what's called a mother and baby unit, where a mother can apply to have her baby with her during her time in prison, up to that baby's 18 months in age. There is the opportunity to extend that slightly where circumstances allow. Women make up only around 4% of the prison population in England, a very small number overall. Even less of them are pregnant or mothers of infants. And therein lies a challenge in and of itself. The prison system was developed for men, by men largely, and it predominantly houses men. It certainly doesn't house very many pregnant women. It houses quite a lot of women who are separated from a baby during their time in prison, and it houses up to 70 babies at any one time in mother and baby units. But these are fairly small numbers, but incredibly complex sets of needs. The government's female offender strategy recognises the very marked gender differences in the nature of offending, predominantly rooted in experiences of unmet mental health need, substance misuse, financial hardship, experience of abuse and trauma, and housing issues. And I know that Christy and Caroline will go on to talk a little bit more about some of those issues later on. We don't know how many pregnant women there are in the prison system, how many go through that system each year. We do know that around 50 births happen among women who are in prison each year. A lot of women are serving very short sentences or are held on remand pending their trial or their sentence, and so a lot may enter pregnant but leave before they give birth, and an untold number come in leaving a baby in the community. Next slide, please. So we've long known at Birth Companions, and more people are coming on board with us on this, that prison will never be a safe or appropriate place in which to be pregnant, give birth, look after a baby, or be postnatal, and navigate separation from a child. And so that's why, as Claudia said at the outset, organisationally we campaign to end the imprisonment of pregnant women and mothers of children up to the age of 2, reflecting the 1,001 critical days. But while we want to end the imprisonment of those women, they are still there in the system right now. So that's why we continue to provide services to them, and we continue to work with a focus on improving the care that they receive while they're there. Women in prison are 5 times more likely to experience a stillbirth compared to similar groups of women in the community. 1 in 10 women will give birth outside of a hospital setting during their time in prison, either within the prison itself or possibly in an ambulance on the way to hospital. There's a higher rate of premature birth and neonatal admission. We have record levels of self-harm across the women's prison estate at the moment. It's higher than ever known before. The severity of the mental health issues within women's and men's prison is unprecedented. And as I say, many women are separated from their babies, and I'll talk a little bit more about recent work in that area later. Next slide, please. So while we work to try to ensure that these women don't enter the prison system, it's a position that the government itself has committed to taking in terms of reducing imprisonment of women overall. There have been some recent developments in the care of women in prison, largely driven by the work that we've been doing, but unfortunately also catalysed by the tragic deaths of 2 babies within the prison estate within just 9 months of each other. As Claudia said, Aisha Cleary, who died in her mother's prison cell during or very shortly after birth, whose inquest is being held at the moment. We're just waiting for the conclusions of that, and baby Brooke in HMP style. Those are, tragic deaths, and we would argue hugely avoidable. But nonetheless, they did bring some impetus to this space. So there is a new policy framework. I say new, it's a couple of years old now, a policy framework in the prison system with a focus on the care of pregnant women, women on mother and baby units, and women who are separated from a child up to the age of 2. That policy is brilliant. We helped to create it. Unfortunately, it's still not being delivered against in practice across the estate. So there's still concerns. The NHS itself has recently published a new service specification for maternity care, which says that all pregnancies in prison are high risk by the nature of the environment. And that's quite a big step change. The Chief Social Worker for England reviewed mother and baby unit applications and unfortunately found, as we expected she would, that there is some very unsafe and uninformed decision-making about who gets to have their baby with them in prison during their sentence or while on remand, and who doesn't. And there's more work to be done in that space. But across all of these things, while we are trying to improve practice for the women who continue to be there, I do think that the emphasis on the mother-child attachment in pregnancy and in those 2 years after birth has a huge role to play in helping with that reform. I should just say it's not radical to propose that we don't have pregnant women in our prisons. Many other countries actively avoid the imprisonment of pregnant women. There's lots of mechanisms for doing that, and we are an outlier. I should say Russia, Colombia, Mexico, many countries don't practice the imprisonment of pregnant women in the way that we do. Next slide, please. So while there's a lot to be done in the prison space, it has attracted a lot of attention in recent years. What's attracted less attention so far is criminal justice contact in the community. And it's something that we really need to get right if we are saying that more women need to be diverted from prison. So we need more work within policing, within the courts, with probation supervision to make sure that women who are, for instance, serving a community sentence have their needs relating to pregnancy and early motherhood recognised and responded to by those agencies. We don't know how many pregnant women and mothers of infants are in these spaces at the moment. The data is not collected, but we do know that 28% of women sentenced by the courts in 2021 received a community sentence, and a lot of those women are aged 18 to 39. So there is going to be a lot of pregnancy and recent motherhood among those groups. Claudia mentioned our window of opportunity research. That was a piece of work that we did with voluntary sector organisations supporting women in these spaces and specialist midwives. And it was really marked how few felt confident that probation, for instance, understand pregnancy, postnatal care, and the impact that can have on women's abilities to engage with what they're being asked to engage with by the criminal justice system, the levels of mistrust that creates, and the implications for healthcare in particular. Next slide, please. So women's fears of losing the care of their baby as a result of contact with the criminal justice system are acute. They're a dominant theme across all areas of our work, even where there's actually, no expectation that they would have that child removed from their care. The fear becomes prohibitive for a lot of women. It does impact on the way that they engage with all forms of statutory service, and then it can become a self-fulfilling prophecy, because if women don't engage with services in the way those services expect them to, going back to some of the things that Peter was talking about, safeguarding concerns can be heightened and the likelihood of removal becomes a more real prospect, actually. A lot of the drivers of involvement with the criminal justice system are very similar to the drivers of removal into care. And, we're talking about domestic abuse, we're talking about unmet mental health need, substance misuse, often as a coping mechanism for trauma. And around a third of women in the criminal justice system, in prison, have spent time in care themselves as a child, which means they are incredibly alert to the risks of social care involvement and losing the care of their babies. So that's why we are launching next month a new publication called the Birth Charter for Women with Children's Social Care Involvement. It doesn't exist online yet, but it will do from the 4th of July. So do keep an eye out for that. And I know that the Anna Freud Centre will be helping us spread the word about that. That is fundamentally about setting out a different approach to the care and treatment of women with social care involvement during their pregnancy in the first 2 years of their child's life. And it's crucially about getting all of these services, criminal justice, social work, healthcare, to all, and the family court system, to all work together to reduce the levels of trauma and the unmet needs among these very vulnerable groups of women, and through that course to break into generational cycles of disadvantage. And that is it from me. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kirsty, for giving such a comprehensive overview of such a complex system, and also for making comparisons and contextualizing it within with different countries as well as around the world. So we'll now move on to Christy and Caroline, and then we'll move on to some discussions at the end.
Okay, thank you, Claudia, for allowing us to be able to talk about perinatal mental health in prison. So I'm Dr. Caroline Pontvert. I'm the perinatal psychiatrist, and I'm talking today with my colleague, the service clinical lead, Dr. Christy Pitfield. Next slide, please. So I'm just going to introduce a little bit our service. We are a NHS commissioned multidisciplinary mental health team working across 3 prisons in England. The female prison estate is made up of a total of 12 prisons, just like Kirsty just said, all of which have varying levels of security and population. So our team is psychologically led by Kirsty, culturally sensitive and trauma-informed, and we adopt a mentalization-based approach of the care we are offering to all women in the perinatal period in prison. We offer perinatal mental health assessment and treatment to all pregnant women in prison and mothers in the prison mother and baby unit. We offer assessment and care to the women in the postnatal period who are separated from their baby if they present perinatal mental health difficulties. So we are mental health clinicians, and this means that we are working with the fact these women in prison, so with the fact that there are women in prison that are pregnant or with their baby in specific units. Our role is to ensure women are offered high quality care, and we are advocates for ensuring the environment implements this. We adopt a stance as a team that the point in which we meet these women, these mothers, is an opportunity, one in which clinical care and support can be provided. Next slide. So Kirsty touched on that. Women make up a small proportion of English prison population, approximately 4 to 5% of prison places. The number of pregnant women in prison is estimated to be approximately 5% of the total female population in prison. Pregnant women in prison are a marginalized group of prisoners within a minority population. And there is a lack of research and clinical understanding of this group. These women's needs and their complexity are unknown, overlooked, and unmet. And this is a risk in itself that we really hold in mind as we approach this specialist area. Next slide, please. So it's well documented that women in prison have multiple and complex needs and have higher rates of mental health, physical health, and substance misuse difficulties compared to women in the community. Women in custody have a 5-time higher risk of developing mental health disorders than the general female population. And research suggests that over half of the female prison population have a serious mental illness. In terms of the journey into the prison system for females and the time they spend there, research has shown that 50% of women who received custodial sentences were given sentence of 6 months or less in 2021. And on the 30th of June 2022, 19% of women in prison were being held on remand. 58% of women are reconvicted within 1 year of leaving prison, and this rise to 73% if they had a sentence of less than 12 months. The point we want to make here is that there is a rapid turnover in the female prison population. And we are mentioning this because it's important. The length of pregnancy is 9 months, and the postnatal period is 12 to 18 months, and women will enter and leave prison at a range of time points across the perinatal period. This means that women in prison who are in the perinatal period are at risk of discontinuity of care, which can put both mother and baby at higher risk of negative health outcomes. For many women, entering custody means separation from their children, and this has been found to be one of the most distressing and traumatic aspects of their experience. Estimating the number of prisoners who are mothers and the number of children they have is problematic. Women may not disclose all their children when entering prison. In 2012, research completed by the Ministry of Justice found that 54% of women had children who were under 18 at the time they entered prison. Next slide, please. In 2012, a survey completed by the Ministry of Justice found that 31% of women in prison had spent time in the care system as a child. in this slide, what we really want to focus on is the trauma that women in prison have been through or have to live with. 53% of women in prison had experienced emotional, physical, and sexual abuse as a child, and 49% reported being a victim of domestic violence at some point in adulthood. And in their research published in 2014, Fredstad et al. Found that 34% of female prisoners had experienced 5 or more adverse childhood experience, or ACEs. Let's put that in a context. In 2014, the National Household Survey of Adverse Childhood Experiences conducted by Bellis and their team showed that for every 100 adults in England, 52 suffered no ACEs, 9 suffered 4 or more ACEs, so 9%. It is unsurprising that the population in the female prisons does not reflect the general population. And I think I want to repeat that. It does not reflect the general population. From a trauma perspective, women in prison sit at the traumatized end of the spectrum. Christy, your turn.
Thank you. So can I go on to the next slide, please? Thank you. So researchers indicated that irrespective of having past trauma, women will experience entering the prison and the environment itself as really traumatic. So women often experience the system as neglectful, hostile, chaotic, and feel powerless in response to having very little autonomy and control. And this can really reinforce themes of previous trauma and lead to psychological distress. So within the cohort of women in prison, there will be women who are pregnant or have recently given birth. Women in prison are already a high-risk group, and many have experiences such as domestic violence, childhood sexual abuse, and history of mental difficulties that in and of themselves are risk factors for a decline in mental health during the perinatal period. And as expected, the literature indeed shows that mental health problems occur at a higher rate in women in the perinatal period in our setting. Women in prison are already an elevated risk of suicide and self-harm compared to women in the community, and completed suicide is one of the leading direct causes of maternal death in the UK. So we often kind of aim for and accept the notion that women in prison should be given equivalent care to those in the community. However, the number of risk factors that have been touched on today, identified in this population, and those specific to the setting, really do indicate that equivalent care for perinatal mental health specifically is the absolute minimum requirement, and the expectation needs to be equitable care, which takes into account all of the added risks, adversities, complexities, and the environment in which we meet these women in. Next slide, please. So as a perinatal mental health team, we've developed an adjusted perinatal frame of mind in comparison to a community perinatal team. It's a trauma-informed service because we are caring for a very traumatized group of mothers and working in a system that will also be holding its own trauma history. Our approach means that every mother that we meet is considered to have survived significant trauma, and these will be shaping her experience to being in prison. And that very same history is relevant to our identity as a mother, which is complicated by whether she is in contact or not in contact with her baby. So being trauma-informed means preventing further harm and not triggering past trauma. So it's recognised that those past traumas will impact on the relationships with professionals in the system. And our approach would be to try to create a system that promotes well-being and safe relationships. Although seemingly crucial to the mental health professionals that we are, it's imperative to remember that we work in a system. Our perinatal mental health service sits in a system with multiple core tasks, and that the prison institution and social care system may not always share those core tasks with us. We do believe that change is possible, and we've seen that, and that's reinforced to us the very fact that our service is embedded and really welcomed across those 3 prisons that we work in at the moment. In terms of the direct clinical work we do, we aim to address and recognise maternal mental health suffering. We recognise and address infant emotional difficulties, and we're trying to break the cycle of transgenerational trauma. We're a healthcare service within the criminal justice system. This means we have to keep in mind the forensic backgrounds and the status of the women that when we meet them. A lot of women who we see do have very serious offences. And most importantly, we acknowledge that there's a very specific set of emotions and thoughts linked to a person's offence and their trial and their sentence. And these need to be managed in parallel to the set of emotions brought on by pregnancy and motherhood. This creates a huge and very significant mental load for a woman, which can really impact on her capacity to focus on, invest with, and bond with her pregnancy or baby. So in prison, the care network around the individual woman, the mother, is very complex. Some parts of the care network exist within the prison or very local to the prison, and some are linked to her home address. For mothers with their babies in prison, the staff who work full-time on the unit, which we refer to as the MBU, provide significant support, and they are the village that's around the mum and the baby. There are often too many individuals involved from our perspective, and the high number of professionals involved is unavoidable in some circumstances, but wherever possible, we advocate for a less is more approach, advocating really clearly for a defined proximal network of professionals around that mum and baby. And across a woman's journey, this care network is going to include clinicians, it's going to include non-clinicians, some who have more or less experience our training in mental health. This means that we all approach situations with a different understanding, a different assumption, interpretation of that situation that's before us. There's going to be different and personal institutional attachment styles. We're going to have different representational wells and biases and trauma histories. And it's really important in our service that we keep that in mind when working with the system. As perinatal mental health clinicians, we've got a very specific core task and area of risk to attend to that really does vary, as I say, from others working across the agencies that we align with in prison around the woman. This can undoubtedly be challenging at times, but recognising this helps us maintain a mentalising position that helps us maintain our roles. So we have a direct role, as I've said, with mums and babies, addressing the suffering and emotional difficulties. But a real significant part of our work has become working with the environment and enhancing the mentalisation capacity of the care network, being present often within the multi-agency meetings as a key part of our work. As it's been made clear throughout today, the majority of women in prison suffer the consequences of repeated relational trauma and have impacted and very distorted views that impact on the capacity to develop trusting relationships, especially with social services and individuals associated with authority. Our aim is to improve an understanding of the women's reactions and holding in mind the impact of the whole care system around the individual, that this is a complex identity that includes being a mother in prison. I want to touch briefly on mothers who are separated from their babies. This is more often than not due to ongoing care proceedings. So our perinatal mental health team does offer support and treatment, and this differentiates us from community perinatal teams. The trauma of separation is likely to reactivate attachment trauma, and we see these women as one of the highest risk groups that we work with. But we do offer continuity of care to these women. We see them through pregnancy and postnatally, and we don't have the condition in our service of whether a mum needs to be with her baby whilst under our care. This helps women to be able to put into words and elaborate a narrative specific to their experience of motherhood, and many of women in the community don't get this experience. Core part of our role is offering training, as you might expect. We're skilling up the network to build trusting relationships, validate distress, identify the presence of perinatal red flags, and ensure women are directed to appropriate services. Having worked in the system for a long time, the emotional impact of this work really cannot be underestimated. It's likely at times to generate very strong reactions in professionals working with these women and their babies. Professionals might have strong views about women's situation of being in prison, but also be helpless to change these circumstances. And any trauma-informed approach really acknowledges that staff and the network and the system will have their own trauma histories and be deeply impacted by the trauma of others they support. We offer reflective practice to lots of staff groups across the services that we work in, and I cannot emphasize enough how important that work has been. Next slide, please. So perinatal period is often named as a window of opportunity, a time where increased contact with healthcare providers can really go on to improve outcomes. So the question is really, how does that work in our service? So research shows that adult attachment patterns affect women's experiences of stress and has real relevance in the perinatal period. So when adults have insecure attachment patterns, it increases the risk of big, kind of unimaginable, unregulated negative emotions, difficulties fulfilling the maternal role, and difficulties in bonding and attachment. Prison can be a very harsh and traumatic environment that triggers unhealthy coping mechanisms in women with insecure attachment patterns. From the perspective of these women, even a healthy pregnancy can be stressful and cause anxiety. Women may have low self-esteem, negative mood, and feel isolated and depressed. They may feel dissatisfied with their relationships with professionals, and even those professionals who are offering help might elicit fear and distrust. And of course, Caroline and I have not been exempt from that at different times. I hope that we're making a strong case so far for why thorough assessment and clinical intervention to these women is so important. And we offer a range of individual and group interventions focused on parent-infant work as well. We work closely with the staff network and really share as much as we can about why perinatal mental health is so important, and trying to help others be in relationships with the women that enable them to stay in their window of tolerance. There's a really small amount of research that considers the prison as an environment that allows for an opportunity, a window of opportunity to improve perinatal outcomes. The research is quite dated, and it is a large systematic review that looks at and focuses on the opportunity of women to have consistent food and shelter, to be away from drugs and alcohol, and away from domestically violent relationships. As we've also mentioned today, and others have kind of commented on the mother and baby units, research supports our observation that these environments can promote well-being of both mothers and babies, allowing infants to form secure attachments to their mothers. These do provide protective features that support maternal mental health, and that's certainly been our experience of working in our service. Final slide, please. Okay, so stay on this slide, that's fine. So in conclusion, each mother in prison in the perinatal period has a unique traumatic past. She's going to have a very personal offence history and an individual attachment system and specific relational style. So each assessment raises this question of what aspects in the environment can be adapted, where the focus will be within the woman, and enables us to meet her in her window of tolerance at a time in prison, so this can be a window of opportunity for change. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much, Caroline and Christy. And if all the panelists want to turn their cameras on now, we've had an incredible range of questions that I think reflect actually the variety of content that everyone's been speaking about. So we've had some questions that are specifically around attachment, and we've had ones that reflect more broadly the patterns, the intergenerational cycles that actually all of our panelists talked about. So I wondered if we could start there. We've had a group of questions that are around the theme of how children of people in prison are affected throughout their lives. So on the theme of intergenerational trauma, could any of the panelists maybe say a bit more about initially the transition of children outside from prison to the outside, and then the effects further down the line that we might be able to predict and mitigate?
So I think, I guess my kind of initial thoughts is just that the transition out of prison is a real high risk period of time, especially kind of particularly where we work. There's a huge support system often around the individual, and often they're going out to circumstances that are populated with problems. I think we do track a lot of work in terms of release planning, thinking about that reintegration into the family, often reintegration with other children, and try and do as much of that work as possible. But the long-term outcomes of that, kind of with or without that kind of level of intervention, are unknown. We don't know the longer-term impacts, and we kind of call for more research and evaluation of that in the longer term.
Yeah, I would reiterate that actually. I think there's a real lack of longitudinal research in this area for fairly understandable reasons. It's very difficult to do, but it is really important. And I think where women and babies are leaving prison together, there can be some very good efforts to make sure that support is there. They can fall apart very quickly, those efforts, because of the weaknesses in multi-agency working across custodial environment and community. I think there are very, very big problems where women are leaving prison and aiming to be reunited with children, or to maintain or restart contact with children who might be in other care arrangements. And one of the starkest issues with that is housing, because when women are released, housing's a massive problem anyway, but they'll often be given accommodation that's not suitable for contact with babies and infants, for instance, and then and then the sort of situation spirals again. So I think that is a challenge. I would signpost people to an amazing organisation called Children Heard and Seen, who work with a specialist focus on the children of men and women in prison, and they do an awful lot of work to make sure that the voices of those children who have those experiences are centred in better practice across all age ranges, and to some extent that's easier to do with older children than it is with pre-verbal children who we tend to be working with. But yes, I'd agree. And the sort of related comment on that is that maternal imprisonment is recognised as an adverse childhood experience, and has huge repercussions for children. And we know that the children of people who spend time in prison are much more likely to enter prison themselves as young people or adults. So it is a cycle that needs to be broken.
Thanks so much, Kirsty. And I guess that there is a link to the next question, which I'll direct at Peter, but also there might be a specific focus here around sort of any studies on neurodiversity. We've had some questions on what happens when the parents might be neurodiverse and the impact that might have on the child, but also how this interacts with neurodevelopmental trauma as well. And the questions are around, is there any research that's useful for practitioners to draw on? But this is a huge topic, so please do feel free to kind of draw on your experience to add any kind of nuance or thoughts to that.
Would you like me to start, Claudia?
Please, thank you.
Okay. Well, it's an enormously important and good question. And I want to really thank whoever it was asked the question that they brought it up, because there is an awful lot of mischief that's being, I think, done perhaps undermining the parenting competence of people who come from who are neurodiverse or feel that they are, or come from that end of the diversity spectrum. I'm neurodiverse. I've got dysgraphia without dyslexia, and my parenting is fine. Well, I don't know what it is. We need to ask my children about that. But it's. I think the important thing is that all of us need support in our parenting, because none of us are perfect, and anyone who assumes that they are able to do it under all circumstances, under all emotional challenges, is probably fooling themselves. So what I want to emphasize here, that we need to empower parents, neurodiverse or otherwise, to do the best they can with their child. From my experience of working with people who were, for example, had carried a diagnosis of autism, they could be supported to be excellent parents, brilliant parents, better than me, but they worked slightly differently. But with the adequate support, they did great. I really would want to try and push back on anyone who wants to generalize on parenting. I know plenty of parents who are not neurodiverse and are appalling with their children. Some of them are my best friends. It's the point I'm trying to make is that everyone needs support, and it's the social context that really determines the capacity of an individual to look after, or the capacity of a social group to look after the development of a young human being.
Thanks, Peter. Sorry, Caroline, were you about to come off mute there?
Yeah. I just wanted to say that what Peter just said is really true for our team. We are tailoring our approach to the need of the parents we are working with, and neurodiverse or not. In fact, that's not the question. The question is what kind of support they need to be the best parent they can be. And that's what our service is offering in prison. In terms of the research, I don't think there is any research that cover neurodiversity and parenting and prison, because that's become a bit niche, but there are research about neurodiversity and parenting and neurodiversity and prison. But the main message will be, if there is a parent in neurodiverse in prison, the mental health services would be supporting them the best way they can, for them to be the best parent they can. Just like for others, we tailor our approach to what the people need.
Thank you. And it kind of links in with something that Kirsty said earlier. Kirsty, you mentioned when babies or children, when the mother or parent is in prison, they might be in there on particular kind of care support plans or with different family members. And I wondered if any of the panelists had support for practitioners who might be working with these families who have temporary care of babies and children, and what kind of it's a complex situation, and what kind of support or things should they be aware of that perhaps might help them in this temporary care, and maybe it's not different to permanent care.
I think if I've understood your question right, I think we see kind of contact with the mums who have contact with children on a kind of regular basis. We see that as something that requires lots of adapted support around that kind of coming back together, and that separation kind of a couple of times a week can be really, really difficult. And there's often lots of concern about how baby's managing that, but actually you need to kind of hold mum and baby in mind. We've done some sort of work ad hoc with kind of foster carers and contact workers who come to prison, just to think around what that mum might need in those moments, so it feels much less threat-based. that is a bit of a logistical sort of situation with barriers, as you can imagine, in our setting, but we would see that as part of our work, and we would see that as part of our indirect work to support a mum while she's with us. To maintain those contact arrangements often as well, if women are finding them too difficult, often they don't go, and that looks really terrible, but there's a really good and valid reason usually why they're struggling so much to get there, and we will try what we can to make that the most accessible for them.
Yeah, I think there's huge practical issues. There's only 12 women's prisons, so women are generally in prison very far from their home and from often where their children are being looked after if they're not in a mother and baby unit. And we see women having to make incredibly difficult choices as well in terms of thinking about whether to apply for a mother and baby unit for their unborn child or an infant that is in the community, because it may mean that they have to go even further away to be on one of those units, and it might mean that they effectively never see their other children for the entirety of the time that they are incarcerated. And women talk about that being as if they are making a choice. They're choosing the younger infant over the other children. And you know, that's an incredibly difficult thing to navigate. I would also say that this is one of the questions that there are huge parallels between the challenges around kinship caring and how you do that as a family member, for instance, and the toll that takes on you, whether you're doing that because the mother is in prison or whether you're doing it because of other concerns in the community. You know, they are very different situations, but the themes and the challenges can be similar. And there's a lot of support for kinship carers provided by Family Rights Group, for instance. And they do some really good resources, and they've done a lot of work to heighten the awareness of the toll that all of that takes on those individuals who often have very little support directed their way as well. So I'd suggest people look there if they want to go into that set of experiences more for maternal grandmothers, for instance, and aunties and people who are often stepping in.
Thanks, Kirsty. Caroline, go ahead.
Yeah, I just wanted to add something. I think to respond directly to what you asked about what advice we could give to the people who are supporting either the foster care or the family members who are taking care of these children. I think it's to help them to keep in mind that these women who are in prison and are parents, they have a complex identity. They're not just a prisoner, an offender, someone. They have a complex identity, and they are many things at the same time. And I think that's very important to support people, in fact, to mentalize them. But the idea would be to keep a complex representation of them and not a black and white one, because that's what the children have. They have a complex image of their mom, or their parents in general. So it's important to keep that alive and not to focus on one part of their identity, I would say. That's really important.
Thank you. And actually, just as you were speaking, we had a question around resilience training and whether you think that there's a place for resilience training to support women in the perinatal period in prison, given that they're likely to face such significant social challenges when they come out of prison.
I mean, it's not something we sort of offer as a sort of standalone intervention within our services. I think we would be trying to think about how we address the mental health first, the trauma, and then kind of the parent-infant relationship alongside of that. I think some sort of psychological interventions have that sort of filtered through, and particularly kind of the ending piece of that work in terms of the generalization to the kind of wider world, and making sure that the sort of therapeutic relationship has value to other relationships, and those that gets sort of generalized, really. That would be the area of resilience that we're trying to instill. I would sort of, the idea of resilience to me actually sat here right now feels like a little bit jarring, of the women that I can kind of envision in my mind right now, but perhaps it's something that we work to, because it's there. It's about growing it when the time's right, I think.
Thanks, Christy. So just actually, there's a couple of questions, Peter, that were asked during your presentation. So I'd just like to go back to some of them. When the image was up, which shows the mother facing the infant and the mother turned away, we had a comment talking about, essentially comparing the two and talking about how do we know which one is useful when. So I wondered if you could say a bit more about what it means for the infant to have the opportunity for both.
Thanks for that question. It's a very good question. The implicit message I was trying to send is that it's both and. That unfortunately, in a very middle class, anxiety-driven, first-time parent identity, mothers and fathers often feel that their major obligation is to be sensitive to the infant, and we have sent, and I think I blame myself as much as anyone else for this. I think it's a culturally inappropriate message, and also it's a very, very narrow message, because making infants aware of those around them is as important as the infant being aware that they matter. And I think getting self and other balanced is difficult, but is essential in parenting. So a child who feels that they are the only thing that matters is not going to be someone who will be able to necessarily recognize the uniqueness of their own child, unless that own child fits them perfectly. So, the difference between them, and understanding difference comes from understanding the spectrum of people that we see around us and being curious about it. So modeling curiosity about people, to me, is the facing outwards is as important as facing towards a child. But a child who never has that experience is probably also being shortchanged. And it has to be a combination of the two. That's how I see it anyway.
Thanks, Peter. Do any of the other panelists want to come in on that point? Well, one thing I did want to ask is, I know, Kirsty, we've worked with your participation team, your lived experience team in your organisation, and all of us here, of course, have been talking about women, but I wondered if you had any reflections, sort of, I guess, a bit on behalf of the women and some of the things that you hear directly from them that might be useful to communicate to some of the people watching and listening today, for them to sort of take home and think about how they work with women directly.
Yeah. Well, one thing that really always comes back to me, but was particularly prompted by a comment that Caroline made a moment ago, is the importance of supporting the ongoing maternal identity of women, regardless of whether they are bonding with an unborn child during pregnancy, or thinking about children that are out in the community while they're in prison, or whether they're on a mother and baby unit. The maternal identity is hugely challenged, and all of the women that we speak to, it doesn't matter how successful their sort of outcomes, have to navigate a very challenged maternal identity throughout their contact with the criminal justice system. And that's because of the strength of the stereotypes and the stigma that we attach to criminal justice involvement. And we're not very forgiving as a society around the drivers of women's offending, or men's, but you know, they are very, very different. And I think that, you know, women always talk about how acutely they feel that they don't want it to interfere with the way that they bond with and attach to their children, but they also find it impossible to park all of that sense of judgment, and unfortunately they see it writ large on the faces of professionals, even very well-meaning professionals, all too often. So I think we have to find creative, compassionate ways to support women to maintain their maternal identity throughout all of that complexity, even though that can be very, very difficult to do. I think that, again, it just sort of matches up with another thing that women always talk to us about, which is the power of a strengths-based, trauma-informed approach. It doesn't need to be necessarily something hugely significant, but having someone recognize in them that their strength and the nature of their trauma, and to show some kindness in the midst of often, you know, a lot of history of unkindness, then that really does fundamentally unlock some opportunities for women. So yeah, I mean, I don't want to speak on their behalf, but that is just a kind of set of personal reflections built on many conversations over the years.
I think it's a really important reflection to sort of summarize and end basically on how, and recognizing the uniqueness of the women that you've been working with. And we just have a couple of minutes left, so I'll just go briefly to Caroline, Christy, and then Peter, just to say some final thoughts, really.
I mean, to that point about kind of the small things that matter, I think one of the biggest shocks for me as working with the system is that the kind of professionals that are with the women, whether it's prison officers, probation, often they don't realise how much they matter. So it's often quite a shock to them when you say, like, you actually really, you matter. And often they're with the women all through the week. If we think about kind of the mother and baby unit staff, they're there all the time, and they've informed such an important part of that mother's kind of support network. So I think that that's something to really balance, where we don't want kind of prison officers feeling like they have the weight of responsibility on their shoulders, but really knowing that they can make a difference in quite a small way. Caroline, don't you know if you have anything to add about that? Just kind of having done quite a lot of training recently with them.
Yeah, we can say that definitely because also it's, although it looks like there is a lot of people involved, it's the same people for a certain period of time compared to community. For example, the midwife who sees the pregnant ladies, it's always the same one, and you don't get that in community, or rarely. So she can really have an amazing impact for these women, and probably she doesn't know how much, and we have to remind her that very much. No, me, if I wanted just to have a quick word, final word, it would be on what you just said, Claudia, about the uniqueness of these women. These women are unique because they are complex identity, and I know we have used the word complex many times, but they have a very unique past trauma history. They have developed strengths and they have weaknesses and difficulties in other areas. They are in prison for a reason, and I think although they may feel that sometimes we forget about the maternal role, probably sometimes we also forget that they are also in prison for reasons, even if they are on remand. And so keeping that in mind is sometimes like keeping a very beautiful big picture And that's where I'm grateful to work in a team that is mentalizing so much and really prioritizing that, and in a care network who accept or try to accept to do it as well with our support, which is really, really great, because it's unique work to work in prison.
Thank you so much, Caroline. And we've just hit 6 o'clock, Peter. So I don't know if you want to say a quick last word on this before we let people go and enjoy the sun.
Just to say how much I appreciate the work that we heard about and how important I think it is in protecting those infants through supporting the mothers in that context. And I applaud the work that you do, and that the mentalizing context really, to my mind, makes all the difference.
Thank you so much again to all our panelists and to our BSL interpreters, and thank you to everyone who came during the sunny weather. And we'll send an email out afterwards with the slides and with the links that we've been sharing in the chat, and responding to any questions we didn't get to today. So thanks again, and we'll hopefully see you at the next Early Years in Mind webinar.